So in the paper, online manipulation, sometimes hidden, always careless, basically address the societal problem that there's recently a lot of concern about manipulation online. I think that takes two broad forms. One form is about a concern about people using technology, especially online technology, to manipulate others, so technology as a tool. And a second worry is perhaps that as technology becomes more and more autonomous itself, so think of AI-based technology that optimizes on itself for a specific goal. For example, to keep you browsing your social media newsfeed. These things change what appears on your newsfeed starting page. And in that sense, perhaps you might think that technology itself might be able to manipulate us. So in recent years, in this kind of broad tech-lash, people have been concerned about that. And in order to make really specific what's going on, I think we need an understanding of what manipulation is. So I address this societal problem, and the philosophical or legal problem is, well, what is manipulation? What are its conditions? So we need to understand that so we can regulate it. One important proposal has been that manipulation is something like covert or hidden influence. That has been very popular in philosophical thinking about manipulation. I put this on the table, show who defended it, and then raise problems for it. Basically, counter examples to the thesis. So I think there's something like overt, non-hidden influence that counts as manipulative. I show why there's a deeper theoretical problem with that thesis. And then I present what I think is a better account of manipulation that doesn't rely on hidden influence. So that's what I do in the paper. And with the result, I think we should be able to better understand what manipulation is. And then there's some implications for how we should go forward in studying it. So hopefully, I think we can at some point regulate it or take measures to prevent manipulative behavior online, either by humans. Also, I think in a certain sense, there's scope for manipulation by machines too. And so we need to understand how we can design machines not to be manipulative. So why is it relevant? I think the broad societal relevance, I think, should be clear, because we are influenced by other people in a myriad of ways. And I think the internet and online technologies just exacerbate the problem. In another publication with a co-author, Fleur Jongepier, we call that aggravating factors. So because technology just enables other humans and perhaps the technology itself to generate more information about us, that information allows us to influence others in more pervasive and effective ways, because one of the first steps in order to manipulate others is to have some kind of knowledge about them. How do they work? What kind of buttons do I need to push in order to make them behave as I want? So against this context or this background, I think it's really important right now to understand what manipulation is. And I think the publication contributes to that question. And then in the sense of where do I really go beyond the literature, I think there's three main points. The first is that I think that the paper describes the problem, the real problem with the covertness thesis, so the idea that manipulation is hidden influence, in a more theoretical way. So many others, Motigorin and Barnhill, for example, they have given counterexamples to the view that manipulation is hidden influence. One of them, for example, is you go to a house viewing and the house owner baked cookies before, so you have this amazing welcoming scent in the house. And that seems something like you would recognize this as an attempt to manipulate you. And that's the point. That the fact that we can think about and recognize manipulation as it unfolds, so to speak, is already, I think, a counterexample against the view that it necessarily is a kind of hidden influence. So these counterexamples have been given, go beyond that by showing that the covertness thesis would imply that we basically can undo manipulation by just uncovering it. So that would imply that we should just educate people online, tell them what's going on, how these algorithms work, and thereby we can basically just make the manipulation disappear. I think that gets the fundamental thing wrong, namely manipulation is an action, and I cannot undo your action by just uncovering it. So I think this is one of the first key contributions. And the second one is that I raise or put on the table what I call the demarcation problem for manipulation. So assume that manipulation can be overt, as I argue and as others have argued before. And it also somehow diminishes autonomy. It has some effect on lowering your autonomy, presumably, at least in most of the cases. Then the question is, well, how do we distinguish that from coercion? We need a further criterion to say that that really demarcates manipulative influence from coercive influence. Unless we do that, I think we risk that manipulation, as it were, disappears as a phenomenon, because we have overt influence that kind of really slides into coercive influence. So the question is really, well, how do we keep these two things apart? What distinguishes them? And I offer an answer in the paper, and that's in terms of spelling out manipulation as a kind of negligent or careless influence, as I call it in that paper. And I've developed that since that paper a bit more. So the idea would be that manipulation is really something about the manipulator's carelessness or negligence in how he or she chooses their means of influence. And I think manipulators are unperturbed. They do not care. And the reasons for why they choose a means of influence is just the effectiveness of the influence, not the extent to which it reveals reasons to others. And I think that's a real interesting analogy with bullshitting, by the way. So bullshitting in a technical sense. Yeah, and that is really, if that is true, that's really a paradigm shift in thinking about manipulation, going from norms or effects. So we spell out manipulation in terms of the effects it has on the manipulatee, the person being manipulated, to a real focus on what the manipulator, the actor, does, and spelling out the properties of the action. And I think that's what we need to do in order to understand manipulation. Two really important avenues for further research. The first is really to understand this idea of revealing reasons to others. So what does it take for me to reveal your reasons for desire, belief, or emotion? So what does that really, what would that involve? And I think that's a deep philosophical question. And I've just begun to start to think about this. But this, of course, would be required in order to understand what this account implies on a deeper level. A second one would be to justify the norm. So what I take myself to have been doing in this paper is to describe, as it were, a common denominator of judgments about manipulative influence. And I think the common denominator is this lack of care or negligence in revealing reasons to others. So that could be a descriptively accurate and true account. So this is what people mean when they talk about manipulation. There's a normative or moral question. Well, is this really how we should think about manipulation? And is this really a norm worth adhering? And I think there's a strong Kantian flavor here. And the question is this norm that we ought to reveal reasons to others? Is this justifiable in a normative or ethical sense? And specifically, does it hold absolutely in all cases, in all situations, or is it moderated by contextual factors? So are there some situational or personal factors that activate or deactivate the norm, as it were? And that's, I think, the scholarly implications and further steps. And practically speaking, for policymakers, I think it's really important that we figure out how we can measure manipulation in this sense. So are there ways to measure whether people did or didn't care in revealing reasons to others. And I have some ideas about that in terms of counterfactual reasoning and counterfactual models. But this, of course, would be crucial in order to legislate and regulate manipulation. So we need to find reliable ways to spot it.